She was 7 when she told the Vampire King she'd be his queen someday. He chuckled and gave her an obsidian token. 20 years later, he found her in chains, broken by war, and this time, he wasn't letting his little queen go. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know. Your support means everything as we bring these supernatural tales to life. The smell of smoke was a living thing, acrid and suffocating, clinging to the inside of Era Quinn's throat. She was 7 years old, and she pressed herself against the cold, damp stone wall of the old granary, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Through a crack in the rotting wood, she could see the flames. They were an angry, hungry orange, licking up the thatched roofs of homes she'd only known as safe. The screaming had stopped maybe 10 minutes ago. It was the silence now that terrified her. Silence meant only one side remained. "Stay quiet, Era." Her mother's voice was a ragged whisper near her ear. Her mother was clutching Era's baby brother, Liam, too tightly to her chest. Around them, for other villagers huddled in the suffocating darkness, the only visible survivors of the mercenaries who had swept through the isolated settlement like a scythe. Then came a sound that made even the distant crackle of the fire seem to fade. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, and somehow utterly wrong. They were the sound of unyielding rock marching across the earth. Oh gods! The Nightborn. The villagers exchanged horrified glances. Era had heard the stories. Vampires. Creatures who ruled the northern territories, who drank blood, who lived forever, and who could tear a grown man apart with a flick of the wrist. They were legend and terror, an immortal judgment on mortal weakness. The granary door, a heavy, ancient slab of oak, exploded inward. Splinters flew like shrapnel. A man stepped through the smoke and splintered wood. But man was not quite right. He was tall, impossibly tall, with skin the color of fine marble in the firelight. His hair was black as midnight, pulled back, revealing features so perfectly cut they seemed carved by ice. He wore armor of deep, burnished crimson and black, and a long cloak that moved behind him like a living shadow. But it was his eyes that stole Era's breath. They were silver, bright and cold and ancient. They swept over the ruined square, assessing the damage and the few remaining bodies with the detached calm of a storm god. Vampire King, one of the surviving mercenaries who'd been looting a barrel, gasped, dropping his crude sword to the dust. The pale man, King Lucien, tilted his head, his silver gaze settling on the kneeling mercenary with the terrible focus of a predator. "You attacked a village under my protection." His voice was soft, melodic, yet it vibrated with a cold authority that made Era's teeth ache. "Explain." We didn't know, Your Majesty," the mercenary stammered, scrambling back. "We thought this was disputed territory." Lucien moved. He was beside the mercenary the next instant. One pale hand, adorned with thick rings, wrapped around the man's throat. "You thought wrong." What followed was over in seconds. Lucien didn't fight, he executed. He moved through the last of the raiders like death itself, a blur of black and crimson, faster than any mortal I could follow. Era heard shrieks, saw flashes of dark, wet crimson, and then there was a ringing, absolute silence that seemed to swallow the noise of the fire. "Come out," Lucien called, his voice echoing in the sudden void. "All of you. I will not harm you now." The survivors stumbled out of the shattered granary and into the blood-soaked square. Era's mother tried to hold her back, whispering frantic pleas to kneel and stay behind, but Era pulled free, stepping into the firelight on bare, dirty feet. Her light blonde hair was matted with soot, her blue eyes wide but focused. Lucien stood among the fallen, a breathtakingly dangerous figure. Not a drop of blood marred his immaculate armor. Behind him, a dozen other beings had materialized from the deep shadows. His court, his followers. They all had the same unearthly beauty, the same cold, predatory stillness. The villagers dropped to their knees, weeping and trembling. Era's mother gasped and yanked her daughter's arm. "Kneel, Era. You foolish girl." But Era Quinn did not kneel. She walked forward, her small feet leaving tiny prints in the ash-covered ground. She didn't understand why, only that she had to. Something in those silver eyes called to the most fundamental, fearless core of her. Lucien's court tensed. A vampire with hair like spun silver hissed softly. "The child approaches the king unbidden." "Let her come," Lucien said quietly. Era stopped 3 feet from him, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, his eyes were mesmerizing silver, yes, but flecked with tiny hints of ruby red, like old wine mixing with moonlight. He smelled of clean winter air and ancient stone. "You saved us," she said simply, her voice clear despite the dryness in her throat. A corner of his mouth twitched. "I did." "Why?" He revealed a perfect line of white teeth, the faintest shadow of elongated canines visible. "Because these villages pay tribute to my kingdom. You are mine to protect." The villagers were horrified that a child would speak so boldly to the vampire king. But Era was 7, and her world had just burned down. Fear felt like a betrayal of the dead. "What's your name?" she asked. A few of the court members made sounds of utter scandal. Lucien, however, laughed. It was a rich, deep sound, genuine, not mocking. "Lucien," he said, crouching down so their eyes were level. "And yours, little brave one?" "Era Quinn." She reached up, daring to touch the smooth, dark clasp on his crimson cloak, a circle of obsidian with a crown carved into it. "This is pretty." Lucien held up one pale hand, silencing her mother's next frantic whisper. His ancient silver eyes studied Era's small, soot-stained face. "You have no fear of me." "Should I?" "Most do." Era considered this, pushing a dirty strand of blonde hair from her eyes. "You killed the bad men. That makes you good." "I am many things, child. Good is not one of them." He tilted his head, genuinely curious. "Why do you not kneel?" Era stood tall, pushing out her small chest. She spoke with the absolute, unshakable certainty that only a child possesses, looking directly into the terrible beauty of his face, "because I'm going to be your queen someday. Queens don't kneel." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. Then his court erupted into a wave of cruel, mocking laughter that echoed off the flames. But Lucien wasn't laughing. He stared at Era, and for a flickering second, Era saw not amusement, but profound, complicated surprise. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and unclasped the obsidian circle from his cloak. He held it out to her on his open palm. "A token, then," he said softly. "For a promise." Era took the pendant, her small fingers closing around the warm, smooth black stone. "When you are grown," Lucien said, standing to his full, terrifying height. "If you still wish to be queen, find me. Show me this token. We shall see if a mortal child can keep a promise to an immortal king." "I will," Era called after him. "I promise." Lucien paused at the edge of the square, his crimson cloak billowing behind him. In the firelight, he looked exactly like the dark fairy tale creature her grandmother had warned her about. "We shall see, little queen." Then he was gone, melting into the shadows with his court. Era was barely listening to her mother's scolding. She was staring down at the obsidian pendant in her hand, at the tiny crown carved into its surface. Someday, she thought. Someday I'll find him again. She had no idea that someday would arrive 20 years later, in chains. 20 years later. King Lucien, Lord of the Northern Territories, stood on the parapet of his fortress, staring out at a sea of grim, muddy earth. He felt nothing but cold, detached weariness. The thrill of battle had faded centuries ago, replaced by the crushing weight of endless bureaucracy and perpetual war. The current conflict, a miserable, 3-year border war with the Human Empire, was proving to be the most tiresome yet. He was called to the central compound to inspect the latest batch of prisoners taken during the most recent skirmish. It was a formality he loathed, but General Cassius, his war council leader, insisted. "Your Majesty," Cassius' voice was clipped cold. "We have approximately 150 captured, mostly low-value conscripts and civilian slaves that an army used for logistics. They will be processed and used for labor as per the standard decree." Lucian nodded, his silver eyes gliding over the huddled, filthy mass of humanity. They were all thin, broken, defeated. He saw no fire, no defiance. Just emptiness. Good. Emptiness was predictable. He walked the line slowly, his polished black boots clicking on the stone. He barely registered their faces. They were objects, unfortunate casualties, nothing more. He was about to turn away when a dull reflection of black caught his eye. The reflection came from a woman near the end of the line. She was emaciated, covered in dirt and old, festering bruises. Her light hair was dull and cropped short, and her face was thin, gaunt, betraying nothing. She was just another broken person, except for the ragged cord around her neck. Hanging from the cord was an obsidian clasp. Lucian stopped. The world narrowed to that single, dark, carved stone. It was the exact shade of volcanic glass he remembered. The exact texture. The exact tiny, childishly carved crown. He stepped closer, silencing Cassius with a subtle hand gesture. The woman didn't flinch, didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge his imposing presence. She simply stared at the mud before her bare feet. He reached out a gloved hand and gently, dangerously, lifted the obsidian pendant from her chest. It was warm. His own forgotten heat still lingered in the stone after 20 years. He knew. He knew instantly, even though the bright-eyed, defiant child was gone, replaced by this skeletal shadow. The little lioness. "Who are you?" Lucian's voice was a low growl, unrecognizable even to himself. She finally lifted her head. Her blue eyes were flat, depthless, shadowed by unimaginable pain. She was trying to hide the spark, but the bare bones of a forgotten courage still lingered in the way she refused to drop her gaze fully. "A slave," she whispered, her voice rough. "No name." Lucian ignored her words and focused on the undeniable truth of the stone in his hand. Era Quinn. He felt a cold, sharp blade of guilt twist in his immortal heart, the guilt of his failure to protect her the second time. This broken, chained woman was the consequence of his centuries of calculated detachment. He dropped the token back onto her chest and turned to his counsel. "This one is not for processing," Lucian stated, his voice now ringing with absolute, terrifying command. General Cassius, a creature of pure logic and military tradition, immediately stepped forward. "Your Majesty, she is simply a human slave. We have hundreds. They pose a security risk if not logged and processed." "She is not simply anything," Lucian snapped, the silver in his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous red. "She is a guest. You will have her cleaned, attended to by the royal physician, and given quarters in the royal infirmary wing." Immediately, the entire court fell silent. Cassius' jaw tightened. "A human slave? In the royal wing? Sire, you are showing gross favoritism and jeopardizing the integrity of the court for an undocumented, high risk." "General," Lucian cut him off, his voice soft, deadly. "I asked for silence. She is under my personal protection. Her name is Era Quinn. And she is now the only prisoner who matters." He didn't wait for a response. He simply took Era Quinn by her raw, manacled wrist, feeling the frailness of her bones, and walked her straight out of the compound, leaving his shocked war council to stare in disbelief at the back of their king, who had just chosen one human slave over all the logic and security of his ancient vampire kingdom. The royal infirmary was not a place built for comfort, but for efficiency and recovery. Yet, to Era, the high, vaulted ceilings and the clean, chilled air felt alien and terrifying. She lay on a mattress softer than anything she could remember, covered in linen sheets that smelled faintly of herbs and something impossibly expensive. Her body, starved and battered, was finally at rest, but her mind was a whirlwind of frantic, panicked energy. The first time a physician, a handsome, eerily pale vampire male, tried to examine her, she had screamed, thrashing so violently against the restraints they hadn't even placed on her that she tore open the healing scabs on her wrists. She didn't recognize this place. She didn't recognize the silver-eyed man who had brought her here. All she recognized was the fear, the pervasive, deep-seated terror that came with being owned. She knew what soft treatment meant. It meant fattening the livestock. She refused the savory broth brought to her, pushing the bowl away until it shattered on the floor. She refused to speak. She refused to open her eyes unless she was forced to. Her defense mechanism, honed over years, was absolute psychological withdrawal. If they thought she was already dead, maybe they would leave her alone. Lucien did not leave her alone. He came during the silent hours before dawn, when the light outside was a weak, bruised gray. He stood by her bedside, a massive shadow against the delicate carvings of the oak bed frame. He never touched her. He simply watched, his silver eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made the skin on her cheeks crawl. "You do not remember, little lioness," he murmured one night, his voice a low, rough melody that held a deep, buried thread of pain. "Perhaps that is a blessing. But you are safe here. They cannot touch you. They." She knew who they were. The ones outside the walls, yes, but also the ones in his court, the ones in his armor, the ones in his beautiful, dangerous face. Safety was an illusion she had learned to distrust above all else. She kept her eyes shut tight, pretending to be asleep, pretending to be gone. While Era lay paralyzed by trauma, the political machinery of the vampire kingdom ground to a standstill. In the great council chambers, the air was sharp with barely suppressed fury. Lucien sat at the head of the obsidian table, his stillness amplified by the storm raging around him. "She must be dealt with, sire. Immediately." General Cassius, his military commander, slammed a fist onto the table. Cassius was an ancient vampire of tremendous power, but his features were harsh and angular, emphasizing his cold, strategic mind. He saw everything through the lens of battlefield calculus. "We have an escalating threat from the Northern Empire, and your action, unprecedented, illogical, has given them a powerful, visible point of leverage." Lady Morgana, the kingdom's chief diplomat, leaned forward, her red hair draped over her silk robes. "General Cassius is correct, Your Majesty. Word has already filtered through the human courts. They are calling her the last free daughter of the North. They claim you are holding the survivor of a targeted slaughter under false pretenses. The propaganda is highly effective." "And you suggest what, Morgana?" Lucien's voice was dangerously quiet. "A trade," she replied swiftly. "They're offering a ceasefire on the western borders and the return of 20 valuable vampire conscripts for this one woman. It is a strategically sound exchange. We lose a slave, we gain essential stability." Lucien's silver eyes lifted, fixing on Morgana with such frigid intensity that she flinched back in her seat. "You would weigh the worth of one promise against 20 conscripts? I would weigh the worth of the stability of a 4-century-old kingdom against an emotional whim." General Cassius roared, losing his composure. "A whim based on a child's forgotten utterance. Who is she, sire?" "An escaped slave with no official identity. She is an infection in our political body, and you treat her like a sacred relic." "That is enough, Cassius," Lucien warned. Lord Darius, the kingdom's head of intelligence, cleared his throat, sensing the king's mood. Darius was usually neutral, dedicated only to information. "With all due respect, my king, the general is only partially wrong about her significance. Era Quinn is more than just a symbol, she is a rallying point. My agents intercepted communiques from the Thorn Emperor himself. They are not merely asking for her return, they are demanding the return of Era Quinn, the girl who survived the Vampire King's betrayal. If you return her, the narrative becomes one of mercy and strategic exchange. If you keep her, the narrative is one of capture, cruelty, and defiance, a perfect casus belli. Darius placed a sheaf of freshly translated documents on the table. They are mobilizing the first wave of 10,000 troops along the riverlands. The demand is simple: return Era Quinn within 1 week, or the war escalates to full, total conflict. They are using her name as the battle cry. Lucien pushed the papers away, his gaze distant. He felt the crushing weight of his duty, the logic of the trade, the security of his kingdom. Every voice in the room, every strategy he had ever learned, screamed for him to let her go. She was an anchor dragging the whole ship into the storm. But then he remembered the tiny, fearless face in the firelight, the small hand closing around the Blackstone, the voice proclaiming, "Queens don't kneel." He remembered seeing her this morning, broken and bruised, yet somehow still refusing to surrender her silence. "The Thorn Empire," Lucien announced, his voice devoid of all warmth, "will receive their answer by end of day. It will be a refusal." Cassius shot to his feet. "Sire, you risk everything for this one." "I risk nothing I have not already risked by allowing her village to be taken from my protection in the first place, General," Lucien interrupted, meeting the furious general's eyes with a gaze that held 4 centuries of cold power. "I failed that child once. I will not fail the woman she became. Send word to the Thorn Emperor. Era Quinn remains in the palace. Tell him the Vampire King has found his queen, and we do not negotiate the terms of our family." The silence that fell was thick with shattered loyalty and dawning fear. Lucien had chosen emotion over strategy, heart over crown. The political crisis was now a certainty, and the war, which had been a quiet simmer, was about to boil over. Era Quinn was no longer merely a prisoner. She was the central, devastating point of conflict between 2 empires. And she didn't even know it yet. Era's physical wounds were closing, stitched by vampire healing and potent blood drafts, but her emotional numbness was slow to retreat. She was still a ghost in the vast, ancient palace, shuffling through the opulent halls, always staying close to the walls, eyes darting, ready to vanish. Her captors, or hosts, as the king insisted, had left her alone after the initial refusal to eat or speak, respecting the king's strange order to grant her freedom of movement within the royal wing. It was during one of these silent, furtive explorations that she found it. She was in a forgotten corridor, a side hall tucked away near the old library, a place clearly not intended for daily use, where the rich tapestries were faded and the air was still and cool. On the far wall, illuminated by a single, high stained glass window, was an immense mural. It was painted in the dramatic, brutal style favored by the Old Kingdom, a night scene, terrifying and chaotic. Flames licked the sky, figures lay still in the shadows, and at the center, standing like a god of judgment, was a towering figure in crimson and black armor. King Lucien. Era stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. The scene was too specific, too vivid to be a mere symbol. As her eyes traced the details, they fell upon a small, insignificant figure in the lower corner of the painting, a child with bright, windswept blonde hair, standing fearless amidst the slaughter, looking up at the king. A crack, sharp and sudden, fractured the carefully constructed dam around her memories. The smell of smoke rushed back. Not the clean, neutral scent of the palace, but the sharp, biting stink of burning wood and fresh blood. The words echoed in her mind, clear as if spoken yesterday, "I'm going to be your queen someday." The memory didn't come in a gentle wave. It hit her like a physical blow. She remembered the fire, the fear, the grand, impossible promise. But then, the mural triggered the memories that came after. She remembered waiting. 2 years after the first raid, her village, believing they were under the king's protection, refused to pay tribute to a neighboring human lord. The lord sent a larger, more savage group of mercenaries. Era, then 9, ran to the center of the square, clutching the obsidian pendant, waiting for the massive form in crimson and black to appear. He never came. The second raid was worse. It lasted longer. Her mother and baby brother were taken, the rest of the villagers were killed, and Era was captured, beaten, and sold south into a lifetime of slavery. She had waited for the king who promised protection, and he had failed her. She had been left in the ashes of a broken promise. Rage, pure and scorching, replaced the numbness she had cultivated. The broken slave identity shattered, replaced by the defiant child who had made the impossible claim 20 years ago. She found Lucien not in the council chambers, but in the map room, poring over tactical projections that glowed faintly in the vampire light. He was alone, his perfect face creased with exhaustion. Era didn't knock. She shoved the heavy door open and strode in, the obsidian pendant clutched so tightly in her hand that the stone bit into her palm. "You," she spat, the word unused and raw. Lucien looked up, his expression morphing from detached concentration to something complex and guarded. "Era, you spoke." "I remember," she accused, advancing toward the table. "I remember the fire. I remember the promise. I remember the day you saved us." She slammed her hand down on the table, the obsidian token clattering onto the map. "And I remember the day you didn't." Lucien's silver eyes locked onto the token, then lifted back to her face. He didn't deny it. The village was protected, Era. My decree was in place. "A decree," she hissed, tears of pure, furious betrayal welling in her blue eyes. "That's what you gave me? A piece of paper that meant nothing? I waited for you. When they came back, I stood in the square with that token on my neck, and I waited for the man who promised to protect me. You were a god to us, and you abandoned us to be slaughtered and sold." She gestured wildly to the bruises beneath her clothing, the invisible scars that ran deeper. "Do you know what they did to me for having this? They thought it was a boast. They beat me and sold me south. Where were you, Your Majesty, when your decree failed?" Lucien pushed himself away from the table. His towering frame seemed heavy, suddenly bowed by an invisible weight. The usual cold mask was gone, replaced by profound regret. "I was occupied with the eastern border expansion," he admitted, his voice rough. "I delegated the monitoring of the northern villages to General Cash's division. He failed to implement the proper garrison protocols. When the neighboring human lord attacked, their message about the severity was delayed, then dismissed as a minor incident." He took a step toward her, his face a landscape of self-reproach. "When I heard the full report 2 months later, the village was gone. I assumed you were dead. I assumed all the survivors were dead. Era, I have lived centuries. I have witnessed entire civilizations crumble. But your face," he paused, the admission clearly costing him immense effort, "your face, your courage, was the one thing I regretted losing. I was too detached. My system was too bureaucratic. My promise failed you." The cold, emotionless king had admitted his fault. He hadn't deflected or justified. He had owned the devastation his carelessness caused. This was a deeper form of pain than anything the mercenaries had inflicted. 2 months later, she whispered, the fight draining from her as the raw truth settled in. 2 months of hell for me, and you were just reading a delayed report. "I cannot change the past," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a plea. "But I can change the future. I brought you here to keep you safe. I am risking my kingdom, my authority, and centuries of stability to keep you from the very enemies who sold you. They are demanding your return to use you to start a full-scale war, and I told them no. They will not take you again." Era stared at him, suddenly seeing him not as the perfect, untouchable god of the mural, but as a man, albeit an immortal one, grappling with immense, agonizing guilt. He had failed her, but he was willing to burn his own kingdom down to fix that failure now. The political storm raging around her, The one she had only dimly sensed now took terrifying, urgent shape. She was the fuse. You told them no? Era asked, the rage now replaced by a chilling clarity. You told the Thorn Empire no? Lucian, you don't understand. I am not worth a war. He looked down at her, his silver eyes blazing with absolute conviction. You are the only thing worth fighting for. The confrontation in the map room had achieved something no healing draft or soft word ever could. It had ripped the victimhood out of Era and replaced it with a desperate need for agency. She was the cause of a looming war, and the thought that thousands of people might die because of her, because of a promise and a king's guilt, was a burden too heavy to bear passively. She had to become useful. She had to become the queen she had promised to be, not the broken slave he rescued. Era approached Lucian with a demand, not a request. You said they won't take me, she stated, finding him on the training grounds observing his elite guard. Her voice was firm, though still thin. But they are coming for me. If I am the spark, then I need to be a weapon, not a shield. Lucian turned, his expression guarded. Era, you are barely recovered. Your training must be slow, strategic. My training must be now, she cut him off, meeting his gaze without flinching. If I am to be your guest, I must be an asset. You have the greatest warriors in the world, the Queen's Guard. I want to train with them. I want to learn to fight for myself, for this kingdom, for the thousands you are risking by keeping me. Lucian studied her. He saw the fire that had replaced the emptiness, the return of the 7-year-old's defiant courage. He saw the transformation beginning. Very well, he conceded, his voice dark with a warning. But you will answer to Captain Saren. She is relentless. She does not know the meaning of mercy, and she will certainly not grant it to the king's new favorite. The next morning, Era was on the training fields. Captain Saren was everything Lucian had promised, sharp, hard, and utterly without sympathy. She was a striking vampire female, built like tempered steel, with hair the color of spilled wine that she kept tightly braided. She watched Era with blatant, judgmental disdain. You are frail, human, Saren hissed during their first session, her voice a low, scornful sound. Your body remembers pain, not movement. You are slow. You are weak. You are a liability. Your only skill is capturing the king's eye, a quality useless in battle. Era said nothing. She couldn't argue with the facts. She was weak. Her years of enslavement had left her joints stiff, her muscles atrophied, and her reflexes dull. When Saren put a practice sword in her hand, it felt impossibly heavy. The training was brutal. Era was paired with the younger, stronger guards, both human and vampire conscripts. She was knocked down in the dirt repeatedly. She was too slow to block, too weak to counter, too clumsy to maneuver. The deep psychological scars often surfaced, a shout, a too sharp movement, or the feeling of being trapped under a larger body would trigger a moment of panic, freezing her entirely. But Era always got back up. She didn't fight to win. She fought to survive the training. Every time Saren insulted her, Era pictured the Thurn convoy, the wagon she was dragged in, the mercenaries who called her a symbol. She used the shame and the trauma as fuel. The deep, agonizing need to never feel helpless again pushed her through the pain barrier. Day by day, the progress was incremental but visible. Her movements became less stiff, her reactions faster. She learned to use her smaller stature as an advantage, ducking under the slow, crushing power of her larger vampire opponents. She didn't just survive the blows, she started to anticipate them. The other guards, initially mocking, began to watch her with a flicker of something close to respect. They had seen many humans try to train for the King's Guard. They had never seen one driven by such a cold, focused internal fire. As the pressure from the Thun Empire intensified, Lucian began to bring Era into the council meetings. She sat quietly at first, listening to the abstract, cynical debates about troop movements, resource allocation, and diplomatic leverage. The vampires spoke in terms of millennia, masses, and strategy, rarely about individual lives. It was during a heated debate over a contested human territory, the farmlands of the South March, that Era finally spoke. The vampire Lord Forlac argued for a scorched earth policy, seizing the land, eliminating resistance, and annexing the vital agricultural hub. General Cassius agreed, viewing the land as a strategic necessity, regardless of the human cost. It will secure our food supply for 5 decades, Majesty, Cassius argued. Unnecessary brutality. Era finally lifted her head. She spoke slowly, carefully, in a voice that was still unused, but carried unexpected weight. You will secure your food supply, yes, Era said, addressing Lucien but meeting Cassius' furious gaze. But you will eliminate the people who know how to grow that food. The human farmers of the South March are the most skilled agrarian workers in the North. If you kill them, you inherit an empty field. You will spend 5 years importing workers, facing endless resistance and cultivating distrust. The long-term cost is greater than the short-term gain. The council chamber fell into a stunned silence. A human slave, interrupting the strategic planning of the High Council. Lucien leaned forward, intrigued. And what is your suggestion, Era? You need the land, and you need their loyalty, Era said, gesturing to the massive map on the table. Offer them protection, real protection, not bureaucratic promises. Offer them favorable trade conditions. You give them a reason to choose you over the Then Empire. You annex the land not through slaughter, but through necessity. You make them feel safe, and they will feed your kingdom for 5 decades, willingly. Lord Darius, the intelligence chief, tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. An interesting perspective. One that factors in the longevity of loyalty rather than immediate control. It is entirely outside our traditional methodology, but strategically sound for a prolonged peace. General Cassius sneered. Nonsense. Sentimentality masquerading as strategy. Sentimentality is a resource, General, Era retorted, meeting his challenge directly. Her blue eyes were cold and focused. It is what keeps an enemy from rising up behind your lines. The Then Empire knows this. They are trying to weaponize my survival. We should counter that weapon with the genuine article, reliable protection and fair trade. Lucien smiled, a small, predatory curl of his lip that nevertheless conveyed deep satisfaction. He had seen his queen. Not the little girl, not the slave, but the clear-eyed, pragmatic leader. Era speaks the truth, Lucien declared, silencing Cassius with a harsh look. The South March policy is revoked. We will proceed with a diplomatic annexation, offering protection and trade. Draft the new accord, Morgana. And, Cassius, inform your troops that Queen Era Quinn will be contributing to the tactical planning going forward. The transformation was complete. Era was no longer just the king's curiosity or his guilt. She had proven herself a necessary, vital part of the kingdom's defense. She had reclaimed her agency, not with a sword, but with sharp, focused intelligence. But even as the vampire nobles began to regard her with grudging respect, Era knew the real crisis was still looming, and she was still the target. The political maneuverings only delayed the inevitable, and the mounting troop movements outside the kingdom's borders were a constant, terrifying reminder. The atmosphere in the palace had curdled. Era's successful intervention on the South March had earned her respect, but it had also fueled the resentment of the old guard. General Cassius viewed her not just as a liability, but as a direct challenge to his military authority, a sentiment shared by several of the ancient, logic-bound vampires on the War Council. Their fear, however, was about to be validated in the most terrifying way. The latest dispatches from the Then Empire arrived at dusk, sealed with the Emperor's personal sigil. The emergency council meeting was called immediately, the summons so urgent that even the king's most ancient, reclusive advisors materialized in the hall. Era, still considered a trainee but now a de facto participant, watched from her usual seat, a chair placed deliberately near Lucien, yet slightly outside the circle of power. Lord Darius, his face etched with rare concern, unrolled the parchment. The Emperor has issued an ultimatum, Your Majesty. This is no longer a border skirmish. He demands the return of Era Quinn within 4 days, or he will unleash his full power. He is mobilizing 50,000 troops along the Great Rift border, and he has offered to exchange 20 of our captured vampire soldiers for her alone. A collective gasp swept through the hall. 20 elite vampire warriors for 1 human woman. The exchange was designed not for value, but for psychological warfare, underscoring the enormous symbolic weight Era carried. The room erupted. A truce. A trade is logical, cried Lady Morgana, her diplomatic mask slipping in her panic. We save 20 of our own and avoid a catastrophic war. The Empire has shown its hand, they will settle for the symbol. Settle? They will use her return to prove the king can be manipulated. Lucien countered, his silver eyes blazing. It shows weakness. It shows strategic sacrifice. Cassius thundered, rising from his seat, his angular face contorted with fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Era. She is immortal, sire. Her life is a temporary cost. Are you truly willing to send thousands of our immortal brothers and sisters to their final deaths because of an oath you made to a child? You swore your blood to the safety of this kingdom. You are sacrificing everything, our territory, our resources, our longevity, for 1 human woman. The accusation hung in the air, a devastating blow aimed directly at Lucien's greatest flaw, his detachment. Cassius had skillfully framed Lucien's newfound humanity as a dangerous compromise. Lucien rose, his immense stature dominating the room. I choose not to negotiate with blackmailers. The answer is no. But the seeds of doubt sown by Cassius had taken root in Era's mind. She sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, terrifying number, 50,000 troops. She pictured the young vampire faces she trained alongside, the grim Captain Saren, the loyal, quiet Lord Darius. They would die. Their lives, eternal and mortal alike, were on the line. And the cause was her. She is immortal. Her life is a temporary cost. The words echoed with chilling, undeniable logic. Era had gained her agency back, but now she had to use that agency to make a choice worthy of the queen she had promised to be. A queen saves her people. A queen does not cause their destruction. The decision crystallized with devastating clarity. She could not ask Lucien to sacrifice his kingdom for her broken self. He had risked everything for her, but his loyalty was too costly. She had to remove the target. She had to take the choice away from him. When the council adjourned, Era nodded politely to the few who still spoke to her and retreated to her chambers. She didn't seek out Lucien. His very presence now felt like a gravitational pull toward catastrophe. She spent the next day making meticulous plans. She went to the training yard, not for combat, but to observe the routine of the outer perimeter guards. She noted the shift changes, the blind spots of the magical defenses, and the location of the old delivery tunnel near the kitchens, a place she had only learned about during a casual conversation with a human scullery maid. That night, she wrote a single, short note to Lucien. She didn't write it as the terrified slave, nor as the bold child. She wrote it as the woman who had learned the true, brutal price of the crown. She found the small, worn leather pouch she used to carry her few belongings. She emptied it, then reached up, pulling the obsidian token over her head. The stone was warm, pulsing with the faint, residual heat of his supernatural touch, a reminder of the promise and the failure. She placed the pendant directly on the center of the note, folding the paper around it like a shroud. This was her final, selfless act of courage. She waited until the deepest hours of the night. Her clothes were the plain, practical garments she wore for training, dark gray, silent. She bypassed the main doors, moving like the shadow she had learned to become in Captain Saren's rigorous drills. She used the lessons of stealth and evasion, gliding through the silent, cold corridors of the royal wing. When she reached the servants' entrance to the kitchens, The air was heavy with the smell of stale bread and charcoal. The maintenance tunnel was unlocked, just as the maid had described. It was cramped, dark, and smelled of earth and rot, but it led outside the outermost ring of the palace's magical surveillance. Era plunged into the darkness of the tunnel, pushing aside her rising panic. She wasn't running from danger, she was running to it. She emerged into the dense pine forest 3 miles from the palace walls, the air sharp and clean. She didn't look back. She focused only on the south, the direction of the Emperor's rallying point. She had 4 days until the deadline. 4 days to become the strategic sacrifice. She would deliver herself willingly and eliminate the excuse for the war. Back in the royal wing, in the pale pre-dawn light, Lucien walked into Era's chambers. He saw the empty bed, the carefully folded clothes, and then the single object left on the white linen pillow. He read the note. I cannot be the queen who destroys your people. I will be the peace. He saw the obsidian pendant resting in the fold of the paper, a rejection of his protection, a final, terrible act of love. Lucien picked up the token, and the immense weight of the betrayal, her betrayal of him, and his failure to ever truly convince her of her worth, hit him with the force of 1,000 years of accumulated fury. The cold, logical king shattered, replaced by an ancient predator denied its mate. He did not call the council. He did not call his generals. He simply donned his darkest armor, his crimson cloak swirling around him, and descended to the stables, ordering his fastest mount. He would not rely on protocols or battalions. Era had left to meet her fate alone. He would ride to save her alone. Lucien discovered the betrayal not through an alarm or a guard's report, but through a chilling, absolute silence. He had gone to Era's chambers to check on her after the disastrous council meeting, intending to argue down her fears, to assure her that her life was worth the cost of any war. But the chamber was still. Too still. He stepped inside. The bed was empty. His gaze swept the room, noting the absence of her small bag, the clothes she now wore for training, dark, functional, perfect for blending into shadows. His eyes landed on the white linen of the pillow. The obsidian token was the first thing he saw. The black, jagged stone, carved with a tiny crown, sat in the center of the pillow, resting atop a folded piece of parchment. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. She hadn't just left, she had rejected his protection, his promise, his heart. Lucien unfolded the note, his hands shaking slightly, a physical tremor he hadn't experienced since his first century. He read her cold, final words, I cannot be the queen who destroys your people. I will be the peace. A profound, sickening realization flooded him. She hadn't merely run, she had planned her own surrender. She was heading straight to the Emperor to offer herself as the sacrifice, believing that her death or captivity would lift the threat of 50,000 troops and save his kingdom. She had acted with the courage and cold logic of the queen she believed she should be, but in doing so, she had delivered the most devastating blow to his spirit. Lucien crushed the note and the pendant in his hand, the sharp edges of the obsidian biting into his palm. The small injury bled red, hot and brief, a stark contrast to the glacial fury that seized his soul. He had lived for 400 years in a state of carefully curated emotional detachment, believing he was too powerful, too ancient to be swayed by mortal feeling. Era Quinn had broken that illusion in weeks, and now she had abandoned him, stripping him bare. His rage wasn't the calculated, strategic anger of a king. It was the raw, primal howl of a lover denied, a predator whose prey was willingly walking into a trap. He felt the cold, familiar guilt of his original failure to protect her surge with tenfold intensity. He had promised she was safe. And she had shown him, with this gesture, that she did not believe his promises were worth the parchment they were written on. He descended to the fortress stables like a storm given form. The stable master, a grizzled vampire who had served his line for 3 centuries, bowed low as Lucien approached his favored warhorse, a massive, midnight black creature named Nyx. "Saddle Nyx immediately," Lucien commanded, his voice deep and vibrating with restrained power. "Prepare the vanguard guard, 30 riders. We ride south fast." General Cassius, hearing the commotion, arrived in full battle armor, flanked by Lord Darius. "Your Majesty, where are you going?" Cassius demanded, aghast. "We must call a full mobilization, prepare the defenses. You cannot lead a mere 30 men against the southern border." "She ran," Cassius, Lucien interrupted, his silver eyes fixed and terrifying. "She is heading for the southern command. She believes she can buy peace with her life." "Then let her go," Cassius shouted, driven by strategic desperation. "Her sacrifice will achieve exactly what we need, a temporary cessation of hostilities. We use the time to reinforce our positions. This is the most logical outcome." Lucien looked at the general, not with anger, but with absolute, crushing contempt. "Logic has its place, General. But Era is not a pawn. She is not a resource. She is mine. I told her I would not fail her again." He mounted Nyx with a fluid, terrifying grace. "If she is to be the peace, she will be my peace, by my side. If the Southern Empire wishes to use her to start a war, they will face the consequences of an immortal king who has nothing left to lose." He looked to Lord Darius, his only remaining anchor to reason. "Darius, keep the council here. Tell them I have abandoned all strategy. Tell them I have chosen my queen over my crown. Tell them to prepare for the total war Cassius so desperately wants to avoid." He spared one final, scorching look for Cassius. "I am not trading her, General. I am taking her back. And if you attempt to send a single soldier to interfere with my path, I will consider it treason." Lucien spurred Nyx forward. The heavy warhorse thundered out of the stables, followed by the silent, grim 30 riders of the vanguard. They were an absurdly small force against the power of a mobilizing empire, but in that moment, they were not a strategic unit. They were a lightning bolt of sheer, desperate will. As they reached the shadow of the fortress wall, Lucien dug his heels in, pushing Nyx to a speed that defied physics. He looked back just once, at the distant, towering structure that was his eternal home, the symbol of the kingdom he was now risking for a mortal woman. He pulled the obsidian token from his palm, the blood from his hand staining the black stone. He tied it securely to his breastplate. "You will not achieve peace alone, little queen," he whispered to the wind. "You will achieve it with me, or we will both burn." The vampire king, abandoning all reason and duty, raced into the darkness, chasing a woman who had dared to sacrifice herself for his sake, knowing that his path would lead directly to the heart of the enemy army. Era moved through the dense forest, her pace slowing with every hour. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the palace was leaching away, replaced by gnawing hunger and the profound fear of the unknown. She didn't know the exact location of the then Emperor's command, but she knew the general direction of the mobilization camp. She just had to walk until she was found. She found them around noon, not in a grand camp, but on a muddy, rutted road near the border, a small, quick-moving convoy led by Captain Boric, a notorious then officer. They were moving swiftly, clearly on an urgent mission. Era stepped out from the cover of the pines, her dark clothing and dirt-smeared face making her nearly invisible until she was just a few feet from the lead rider. "Stop," she said, her voice raspy. She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I am Era Quinn. I am the prisoner the Emperor seeks. I have come willingly." Boric stared at her, then broke into a harsh, triumphant laugh. Well, well. Look what the king's obsession coughed up. Take her. Quickly. The Emperor will be overjoyed. She's saved us a war, boys, or rather, given us the perfect excuse to start one." They dragged her roughly onto a supply wagon, binding her wrists and ankles with tight rope. The humiliation and fear of being back in chains was immediate and overwhelming, but Era held onto the cold comfort of her mission, peace. She had sacrificed herself, and the kingdom would be safe. Lucien found the convoy barely an hour after they took Era. Nyx, the warhorse, was lathered in sweat, pushed to a supernatural limit. The 30 riders of the vanguard were strung out far behind their king, barely able to keep pace with his desperate flight. Lucien didn't need scouts. He didn't need intelligence. He simply followed the path of his own rage, a heat sensor zeroing in on the location of the enemy who held his queen. He saw the dust cloud first, then the flash of their green and bronze armor. He spurred Nyx over a slight rise and descended upon the convoy like a black-cloaked thunderbolt. What followed was not a battle, it was a reckoning. Lucien didn't issue a warning. He didn't call for surrender. He simply struck. He was off his horse before Nyx had fully stopped, moving faster than any mortal I could track. He ripped through the soldiers, his immense power unleashed in a focused, savage attack. His sword, a long blade forged from meteoritic iron, was everywhere at once. It moved with lethal efficiency, slicing through armor and bone. The Thurn soldiers were highly trained, but they were facing a legend, a creature whose movements were defined by 4 centuries of combat and whose fury was fueled by a love he had denied for centuries. They screamed, they scattered, they tried to form a line, but Lucien was a maelstrom of destruction, his crimson cloak swirling around him, the small, obsidian token flashing on his chest. Era, bound and thrown to the floor of the supply wagon, covered her head, the sounds of snapping bone and gurgling screams overwhelming her. She could feel the wagon rocking violently as bodies struck its sides. She smelled the metallic tang of fresh blood, thick and everywhere. He came. She thought, a dizzying mix of horror and relief crashing through her. He came. The fighting stopped as suddenly as it began. A terrifying silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the dying and the ragged breathing of Lucien. He pulled himself up to the back of the wagon, his massive frame blocking the daylight. He was coated in blood, a thick, wet crimson that wasn't his own, darkening his armor and streaking across his perfect, marble face. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his silver eyes blazing with a mix of exhaustion and absolute, total victory. He found Era huddled on the floor, her wrists chafed by rope, her eyes wide with terror and shock. He knelt, his blood-soaked glove gripping her chin, gently forcing her to look at him. "Why?" He choked out, the word raw and desperate. "Why did you run?" Era, seeing the monster he had become in that moment, the carnage he had wrought for her sake, didn't flinch. She had to make him understand. "The 50,000 troops," she confessed, the words spilling out in a rush. "The ultimatum. Cassius was right. I am mortal. My life is a temporary cost. I had to save your kingdom. I had to be the peace. I would have traded myself willingly to save your people." Lucien recoiled as if struck. He leaned his head against the wood of the wagon, letting out a sound of deep, wounded anguish. Then, slowly, he reached out, his bloodied hand tearing the ropes from her wrists and ankles with savage force. "Do you not understand yet?" he demanded, pulling her up against his chest, crushing her into his iron armor. "The kingdom means nothing. The longevity, the politics, the power, it is all dust. I have ruled for centuries, numb and cold, until a child made an impossible promise and returned broken." His voice broke, a terrifying, human sound. "I risked everything for you because you are my everything. You are the only thing that makes me feel alive. You are the only future I care about. You talk about saving my kingdom, Era. You are the kingdom." He was no longer the aloof king, but a man, an immortal man, in the throes of a desperate, newly discovered love. The confession, made in the midst of blood and destruction, was the most honest, vulnerable moment of his long life. Era looked up at the king, her terror slowly being eclipsed by the profound, shocking truth of his words. This terrifying, ancient being had annihilated a company of soldiers not out of strategic necessity, but out of personal, desperate love. He had chosen her over his entire empire. Lucian, she whispered, reaching up a trembling hand and wiping a streak of blood from his perfect cheek. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. You tried to save me by abandoning me. I came to save you by tearing the world apart. He opened his eyes, the silver softening with absolute devotion. Do you believe me now, little lioness? Do you believe you are worth the cost? Era nodded, tears finally flowing, washing the dirt from her face. She held onto his armor, grounding herself against his powerful, steady heart. I believe you, she whispered. Take me home. Lucian lifted her into his arms, ignoring the blood and the stench of death. He placed the obsidian token back around her neck, securing it with a careful, gentle touch. He walked out of the wreckage, his warriors of the vanguard finally catching up, witnessing the silent, blood-soaked reunion. The Vampire King, his mission complete, placed his queen on Nyx's back, secured her in front of him, and turned the horse toward the north. They left the 50,000 mobilizing the troops without their symbol, without their excuse, and facing the impossible reality of a king willing to start a total war for a single woman. 3 months passed. The war that General Cassius had predicted would engulf the kingdom never fully ignited. The Third Emperor, stunned and strategically crippled by the vanguard's lightning assault and the total destruction of his forward unit, an attack executed by the king himself, hesitated. Lucian's savage defiance achieved what diplomacy could not, a realization that the Vampire King was no longer predictable. He was driven, and the cost of crossing him for one woman was deemed too high. Negotiations for a definitive peace treaty, not merely a truce, began in earnest. Era did not wait in silent gratitude. Having secured her freedom and her king's heart, she embraced the political arena. She attended every council meeting, not as Lucian's captive or paramour, but as a clear-eyed political entity. She used her unique position, human, slave survivor, warrior, and queen-elect, to mediate disputes, ensuring that the final peace accord was fair, providing protections for the human settlements without weakening the Vampire Kingdom's necessary borders. Her pragmatic, non-sentimental approach to resource distribution and governance earned her the grudging, but authentic, respect of Lady Morgana and even Lord Darius. The treaty was finalized at the autumn equinox, a time historically associated with balance and harvest. Lucian decreed that the formal signing would be combined with the ancient ritual of the vampire coronation. The message was unmistakable. Peace was inseparable from the crowning of his queen. The great hall of the fortress had never been so crowded or so tense. Every major power was represented, the cynical remnants of the then empire, the wary ambassadors from the free human kingdoms, and the entire vampire aristocracy, led by a solemn, skeptical General Cassius. Era stood beside Lucian, dressed in a gown of deep midnight blue velvet, designed to reflect the darkness of the night-born but tailored to the style of the human courts. She wore no jewels, save for the obsidian pendant, now polished and prominent, resting against her collarbone. She was no longer frail, her posture was straight, trained by Captain Saren, and her blue eyes held the clear, unwavering gaze of a leader. Lucian began the ceremony, not with traditional declarations of conquest, but with a story. 20 years ago, his voice resonated through the hushed hall. I stood in the ashes of a burning village, having saved a few scattered lives. I thought nothing of the act, it was mere duty. Then a 7-year-old girl approached me unafraid. He paused, his silver eyes sweeping over the human envoys, then settling on Era. She did not kneel. She asked my name, and she made a promise. She said, I'm going to be your queen someday. Queens don't kneel. I gave her a token, a piece of obsidian, and I laughed. I returned to my immortal world, dismissing the courage of a mortal child as a momentary distraction. Lucian's gaze darkened, focusing on his own court. I failed her. My bureaucracy and my detachment allowed her to be seized and broken. 20 years later, I found her in chains, having paid the price for my failure. He took Era's hand, his touch reverent. She returned to me in chains, but she is the one who set me free. She forced me to confront my own lack of heart, and she taught me that true power is not measured in centuries of life, but in the willingness to risk everything for a single, precious truth. Lucien lifted a heavy, ancient crown of dark gold and ruby. It was the ancestral crown of the vampire kingdom. Era Quinn attempted to sacrifice herself for this kingdom, Lucien declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. She offered her life for the peace of my people. That is the act of a true sovereign. I crown her now, not merely as my wife, but as my equal, as the fulfillment of a promise and as the bridge between our two peoples. He lowered the heavy crown onto her head. It was done. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence in the hall was deafening. Then General Cassius, the rigid, unforgiving soldier who had argued most vehemently against her, dropped to one knee. "My queen," he muttered, the words stripped of all malice, replaced by reluctant respect. Lady Morgana followed instantly. Then Commander Vex. Then the entire vampire court, one by one, until every Nightborn in the hall was kneeling. The human diplomats, stunned, looked at one another, then slowly, hesitantly, began to bow. The court that had mocked a little girl's promise now knelt before the woman who had transformed her trauma into power. Lucien took Era's hand and raised it high, and the hall erupted in a roar of sound that hadn't been heard in centuries, vampire and human voices mingling in genuine celebration. That night, Era leaned against Lucien's shoulder on the high, royal balcony overlooking the city. Below them, celebrations raged. Torches flared and, incredibly, human folk music mingled with the deep, melodic sounds of vampire instruments. For the first time, vampires and humans were dancing together, toasting peace, daring to hope for a future that wasn't defined by blood and fear. Era touched the cold metal of the crown resting on her head, then gently touched the obsidian pendant beneath it. "No regrets?" Lucien asked softly, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist. "Not a single one," Era confirmed, a tired but genuine smile gracing her lips. "Even though being queen means endless council meetings and dealing with General Cassius' perpetual skepticism." Lucien chuckled, a rare, rich sound. "That you have, my brave little queen." He pulled her closer, his centuries of loneliness finally melting away in the warmth of her presence. As the city celebrated below and the stars wheeled overhead, two souls, one immortal, one mortal, separated by species and scarred by time, finally found their fulfillment. It wasn't in a kingdom or power, it was in the shared, simple truth of their enduring, hard-won bond. The promise was kept. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next.